Heyo everyone, I'm Jay from Boulder Creek Railway. In this video, I will show you all how to build one of my 3D printed Climax locomotive kits. The kits will be just over $5 and will be available at colts3d.com. The model is designed to fit on one of the 3 different Kato 2 truck chassis. These chassis cost anywhere from around $30 to $40 and are very easy to find. I noticed that there are not many options for end scalers who wanted geared locomotives. I decided I wanted a Climax locomotive to go along with my Atlas Shay. However, I could not find any models for a price under $100 or a model that was designed for standard gauge end scale track. I decided to create one for people who had 3D printers. If you don't have a 3D printer, don't feel left out. If you want this model, you can purchase the files on Colts3D at my page, then take it to a local 3D printing company or public library. Many libraries in America are starting to get 3D printers for public use. The charges are small and some libraries even allow you to use them for free. I hope this video will help you in the construction of your locomotive, and as always, happy railroading. For this kit, you will need 1 Kato chassis, 1 cab, 1 boiler, 1 Climax chassis, 1 oil bunker, 1 left and right side piston, 2 front steps, 1 front light, 1 smokestack, 1 left and right side running board, 1 backup light, glue, and a hobby knife. Make sure your parts are cleaned before you go ahead and start assembling your model, since the supports will be there after printing. Alright, the first thing you're going to need is your chassis. Remove the tan piece at the top. Then, test fit all your pieces. Start with the chassis, and then move on to the cab and oil bunker. Finally, put on the boiler. This will give you a general idea of how your locomotive is going to turn out. Alright, now to take your chassis and to glue the cab and oil bunker to the back portion of the chassis. Make sure you have a little bit of space between the oil bunker and the edge of the back portion of the chassis. That way your people have a little bit of a place to walk. Now it's time for the cab. Notice the holes in the model on the other side of the cab. Those will be filled in later with a bit of clay. Glue this at the absolute edge of the chassis. Make sure all the parts are lined up, and then set it to dry. Now it's time to do a little bit of work to the boiler. Now your smokestack may have printed a bit wrong, so I included a separate one in the model. The smokestack is a really tiny piece and it's very difficult to glue on. As you see, I just dropped it right there. It might take a little bit of trial and error, but once you get it on there and it's stuck on, it shouldn't move at all. Alright, so now we want to glue on a few of the parts here. Alright, so we want to glue the front portion of the chassis to the running board portion. Make sure those are straight. Mine came down a little bit and it was a little bit problematic, so I had to fix it later. Ta-da! Make sure that you break your chassis cover on the motor portion in half. You want to keep the back portion. Cut it around the area where you have the little bit of the holes. You need this piece because it keeps the motor in place. Without it, your motor will be flopping around and the contacts won't touch. Attach it and then put on your cab and boiler portion to test fit and make sure it all works out. Now let's take that out of the way. Move the chassis out. So now we're going to take the chassis and we're going to glue on the front running board and the front part of the Locomotive chassis to the Kato chassis. Now would also be a good time before you glue to take the couplers and replace them with better ones like Microtrains couplers. If you haven't already done that, of course. I ended up doing it a bit later and it was a little bit of a pain to remove them. It's still possible though. Test fit the oil bunker and cab back on the Locomotive. Now it's time to glue the boiler to the rest of the Locomotive. When you do this step, make sure you have enough room on the inside where the worm gear is on the boiler. It should fit normally anyway, so you shouldn't have any problems putting it there and gluing it down. Just make sure you try not to get any sort of debris or glue on the inside near that worm gear. You don't have to apply glue to the front part of the Locomotive there. Only the back is really necessary. I did it there at the front just to make sure I could keep the whole thing down. If you're going to paint the Locomotive, you shouldn't really put it there if you want to paint them up in pieces. I painted mine up in pieces. Luckily I didn't put the glue there too heavily, so it was very easy to remove from the front of the Locomotive. Make sure everything's lined up perfectly. And also make sure that the wheels spin on the front of the Locomotive where the worm gear is. Now it is time to apply on the pistons. This is a very tricky step. Well, it was a little tricky for me at least. When I glued them, I tried to glue them almost vertically and they kept falling off. Of course, when you glue it, you'll glue it on sideways. I just had to glue it like this for filming. Glue it on the portion right there and right there on the clip where the rest of the tan portion should be on the front part, on the chassis cover. Once it's there, let it sit for a bit before moving on to any other portions. You want to make sure this part is really stuck in there because you don't want it sliding around and being annoying. As you can see there, I skipped ahead and already put on the second one. Now it's time to glue on the headlights. This is specifically the backup light. Now the backup light is designed so that it can be put almost anywhere on the Locomotive. It has a little bit of a slit so you can put it there on the roof if you'd like. However, I prefer to put it on the oil bunker of the Locomotive. You could put it on either side of the oil bunker, or you could put it on the back of the oil bunker. It's all just up to you. The backup light is important, or it could be unimportant depending on the prototype, or depending on the railroad you'd like. Alrighty. Now we're going to do a bit more work to the Locomotive. We're going to add on the very tiny front headlight. This is designed to have a little bit of an overhang on the Locomotive. There's a little bit of a gap in it so it can fit perfectly on top of the boiler. Put a little bit of glue there and attach it onto the front of the locomotive. This part is very small, so it might fall off similar to the smokestack. Just be careful. As a quick note, if any of these pieces didn't print correctly, or your printer can't print them small enough, screw around with your settings a little bit. Try not to do anything dumb to your 3D printer or to your software, but try to make sure you print all these parts on the highest possible setting so it can print the smallest of parts. Now it's time to glue on the back footboards. What I'm trying to do there is I'm trying to point that there's a little bit of a black overhang on the back of the locomotive. It's easier to notice in this shot here. You're going to want to put glue on that little black overhang and on the white portion of the back part of the locomotive chassis. This way that it won't fall off or the part might not work. Of course, make room for the coupler to move around in there. You don't want to make it stuck on the footboards that you can't turn the wheels on the locomotive. Make sure it dries straight. It might want to lean over a little bit due to the weight. The final few steps is to apply the footboards to the locomotive. There should be a window on the locomotive that is a little bit lower than the others. You should apply the footboards at the bottom of the window. Make sure you do this on both sides of the locomotive. Also note that these parts are very, very small and delicate, and that they might move around a little bit. So make sure that when you glue them down, you don't accidentally nudge the locomotive, as this part may move around or go sideways or fall off. This would probably be an easier step if you had tweezers though. Here's a shot of it on the locomotive. Here's a picture of the Climax next to my Atlas Shay. The Atlas Shay may look a little bit smaller, but they're actually both to scale. It's just that the chassis is a bit higher. For painting the locomotive, you will need black, charcoal, parchment white, and red. Each of these colors have a different use. The red is used for the front walkways, the black is used for the boiler, the white is used for lettering, and the charcoal is used for other parts of the boiler. You will also need a paint tray and a water and brushes. Start by taking your locomotive and separating the locomotive from the chassis. Put the chassis away for now, as we're only going to be working on the first part of the locomotive. Start by painting the front of the locomotive charcoal. This is the part of the boiler at the front where we have name tags, the smoke stack, the front lights, and the nameplate is most of the time is here on the locomotive. Make sure this is all painted in charcoal, as it gives a good color contrast against the black that will be used to paint up the rest of the locomotive. If you don't have these colors, try to find a different substitute. Now it is time to plug in some of the holes in the model that may have caused problems when you 3D printed. On mine, the cab of the locomotive had a few holes in this on the right hand side of the cab, so I just had to plug it in with a bit of white clay. Putty will also work, or any other sort of material. Silicone caulking will also work as well. Just make sure you fill in these holes, because when you don't really want holes in the part of your locomotive. Also make sure to clear out any areas that you may not want any sort of clay or silicone or whatever sort of putty that you're using. Alright, so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to paint up the rest of the locomotive in black. This will cover up the entirety of the locomotive, leave nothing untouched except for the part of the locomotive at the front that we already painted in charcoal. This will give you your standard color. Also, avoid getting paint on the inside of the front light and backup light. The white filament that I used makes it a little bit reflective. If you're not using a white filament or you're using a different type of filament, you can put some sort of reflective color like silver on the inside to make it seem like it lights up. Alright, so now we want to remove that part of the locomotive to let it dry, and now we're going to continue on to the powered chassis portion. For this, you're going to want to use charcoal to paint up a majority of this. You're going to want to paint both sides of the pistons as well as the covering for the motor on the Kato chassis. Make sure you cover up that Kato chassis to cover, because if you remain it tan, it's going to be very, very, very noticeable, and it won't make for a very realistic model. There's not really a way of hiding this since, as I said earlier, it keeps the motor down, and there's not any other way you can really keep it down without using tape or something. But I decided that it's easier just to use the pre-made piece and just cut it to an appropriate length. Try not to get any paint on the contacts or any other part of the locomotive that may cause any mechanical issues if paint were on it. Also try to get in all those little itty bitty details on the locomotive so you don't have any white or whatever sort of filament that you're using showing through. Don't forget the undersides. Alright, so now we're going to do a little bit more work to the boiler portion of the locomotive. I want to get in some of those areas and touch up some of the areas that may not have gotten paint. I want to make sure that the line between the front part of the boiler and the rest of the locomotive is a nice, crisp, clean line. That's what I'm doing here, just touching it up a little bit to make sure it's a perfect, beautiful line. Alright, so now it's time to paint the footboards red. I use a barn red color for this. I like the red as I've seen a lot of geared and logging locomotives have a red piece here on the wood. I know that this may not be your choice of color, and of course, it's your railroad anyway, so you can paint your locomotive in any sort of color scheme you'd like. If you're matching a specific prototype, you don't have to paint yours red. I just like this color. Make sure you get the pieces where the footboards are as well. Later we'll touch up some of the details like the metal that attaches the footboards to the rest of the locomotive. Also, don't forget the bottom part. Alright, so now it's time we do the rest of the footboards on the chassis of the locomotive. Same sort of situation, use some red, clean it up a little bit, and make sure both of them look really nice. One thing to note, do not paint red on the very big portion of the chassis on the front of the locomotive. That's a separately applied part. You should paint that in black if you're choosing to do that. Also be careful of the footboards. As you can probably see on there, it's a little broken off. I re-glued it later so it would work better. Of course, if you screw up, you can touch it up later. I ended up doing that anyway. Take your time with this. You want to make sure your locomotive turns out really well. Alright, so now it's time that we do a little bit more paint and paint up that portion that I mentioned earlier, the front part of the chassis. I'm painting that in black. Just make sure that gets a nice black coating and try not to get any paint on the front of the running board portion. Also make sure to get in underneath the locomotive near the wheel sets. Don't paint the wheel sets, but get the little white portion that's under there. You want to make sure this turns out really well so that you can impress your friends with this nice model. Alright, time to put everything back together, and ta-da! Here is your brand new Climax locomotive, ready to go. I'm just going to take a little bit of time here to show you the rest of the locomotive. I think that turned out pretty good. Thank you for watching, and happy railroading!